During the press availability session at the White House earlier on Monday, local time, the South Korean and American leaders appeared united in their calls for nuclear disarmament on the Korean peninsula and for dialogue with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. Hello and welcome to Wednesday's edition of Press Perspective. It's August 27th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. The first summit between Seoul and Washington under the Lee and Trump administrations took place at the White House in the afternoon on Monday local time, which was in the very early hours of Tuesday here in South Korea. Now today we continue our panel session on those talks and more. For this, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, welcome back.
Nice to be here.
I also have Professor Park Won-gon at Ewha Womans University joining our session virtually. Professor Park, as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Steven, we will start here. So generally speaking, is the foreign media lauding or lamenting perhaps President Lee Jae Myung's diplomatic maneuvers, if you will, at the Oval Office? What has been the response thus far, Steven?
I think if you were to read through the foreign media coverage, you'd probably get the impression that things went pretty well. A lot of foreign media coverage has focused on the apparently chummy interchanges between Lee and Trump. Like, they seem to get along pretty well. They seem to be kind of joking back and forth. And that was not entirely surprising. I think like a number of people have speculated that Trump and Lee have certain things in common. They're both kind of political outsiders. They both had, rocky but ultimately successful careers. And Lee is, I think, pretty well known as he's used the word pragmatist a lot since he came into power, wanting to put South Korea's national interest first and foremost, and wanting to not approach international exchanges through the lens of any particular ideology, but kind of try to get along with everybody in every possible scenario and just kind of do what's best for the country. And so another thing that I think an observer of the foreign media coverage would come away was that Lee he seems to have like kind of prepared a kind of pitch, a kind of, he seemed to have gone in there with like a specific strategy in mind, where like he had prepared some gifts, and they were talking about golf and a number of other things, where it seemed as though they had a particularly good chemistry, even though the fact that I think they don't really share a common language. I don't think Lee's English is perfectly fluent, and Trump certainly doesn't speak Korean, but they didn't let that stop them from engaging with each other. I think Lee even felt comfortable enough that he was able to kind of joke about having been a bit nervous about a possible Zelensky moment. You know, he was nervous about the potential chance that he could suffer a fate similar to what Ukrainian leader Zelensky went through when he was in the White House and kind of got faced a barrage of questions that were not entirely cordial in tone, and kind of had to defend himself. Lee kind of seemed to have. One thing I keep telling foreign observers of Korea is that, Lee Jae Myung is not a rookie when it comes to being a public figure. He's been in the public eye for a very long time. Before he became president, he held pretty high-profile political office as the governor of Gyeonggi Province and the mayor of a satellite city called Sangnam. And in those posts, he was really quite good. He had very good approval ratings when he was in those positions, because he was quite good at engaging with his constituents and trying to give people what they wanted, trying to address the needs of whatever was happening in those communities. He's now leading an entire country, which is a much more challenging endeavor, but he seems to be applying the same kinds of strategies. And just to say one more thing about his meeting in the U.S., I would just say that it's important to note that he didn't come away with a kind of massive victory when it comes to things like trade or some of the other, kind of more thorny issues. But I think the expectations, factoring in the expectations of this meeting, that it was their first and there was, some kind of tensions leading up to it, I think the general assessment is that it went pretty well, but I would just flag that there's a lot more work to be done still.
Right. Keeping in mind then what Steven has just said, Professor Park, speaking as a scholar, how would you evaluate this first exchange between the two leaders?
Well, I have a very similar feeling as just Steve mentioned, even though I'm the scholar, but the summit to me is like a roller coaster. So 3 hours before the meeting, President Trump posted on the social media, and he was talking of the purge or revolution. And those messages sent tension through the roof. So in the end, the summit avoided the worst scenario, as Justin mentioned, like they remind me about the President Trump and President Zelensky back in February. At the same time, it was the very first meeting between President Lee and President Trump, and it took place in the friendly atmosphere, as just Stevens correctly described. There was a very clear personal chemistry between these two leaders. And that matters because when President Trump runs foreign policy in such a personalized way, his feelings toward the other leader often shape the policy itself. His dislike for Zelensky, for instance, clearly affected his stance on the Russian-Ukraine war. From that angle, this was a success for Korea. But the summit fell short of the main goals. After Trump's tariff measures, Seoul and Washington did reach an agreement on July 30, but major gaps remained on Korean investment in the United States, on opening Korean markets, and on the defense cost sharing, etc. This meeting should have tied up some of those loose ends, especially on both sides, called the modernization of the alliance, but that consensus didn't come. So we should expect some very tough negotiation ahead. Not the expert, but as a professor, if I had to give this summit a grade, I would say incomplete.
Right. Professor Park, during the press availability session at the White House, Mr. Trump floated the idea of securing ownership of the South Korean land that houses the U.S. military base here in the country. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, is this a feasible request, do you think?
Well, it seems President Trump was either mistaken or perhaps he was making very calculated move. First of all, his claim that the United States leased its base in Korea is simply wrong. Under the status of first agreement, or SOFA, the land used by U.S. forces in Korea is provided free of charge by the Korean government. There is no rent, no lease payment at all. Article 2 of SOFA clearly states that the United States is granted the use of facilities and areas in Korea under the Mutual Defense Treaty. So when President Trump said, quote, "We want to end the lease and see if we can own the land where our big bases are," it doesn't hold up because there is no lease to begin with. My guess is that he may have confused a little bit about this with Japan. I mean, in Japan, the cost of land rent is calculated into Tokyo's defense contributions. If Trump truly wants ownership of the bases, that would be the kind of self-defeating. Today, the United States forces Korea pursue what Washington calls strategic flexibility. That means Korea takes the lead in defending its own territory, while the United States forces are used mainly to check to China and operate beyond the peninsula. But if the United States actually owned the bases as American soil, then Washington would be directly responsible for the defending them. That would tie America down more tightly to Korea. So from the Seoul's point of view, that would not be a bad thing. It would make the U.S. troops an even stronger tripwire, which Americans don't like this word, but meaning America would automatically be involved in any conflict that breaks out here.
Right, Professor Park, thank you for clarifying that. And also, of course, another misleading claim, if you will, by Mr. Trump during the summit was the fact that he claimed there were 40,000 troops here in Korea, South American troops, that is. Essentially, there are 28,500 troops, of course, Stephen, I'm sure you're aware. Stephen, speaking as a staff member of the Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia, what has been the response in neighboring Japan with regard to the summit between the South Korean and U.S. leaders?
Okay, well, in my answer to that, I would just talk first about the summit between Lee Jae Myung and Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba. I was in Tokyo to cover that over the weekend, and so I can kind of relay what I thought the reaction was in Japan at the time, and I think it was a kind of a lot of positive feelings because, again, just to frame this in the context of expectations, I think a lot of people in Japan had the expectations or a little bit of nervousness about Lee as previously a quite vocal member of South Korea's progressive camp, which has customarily been quite hard on Japan. Lee himself, I mean, as I was covering this, I went through the archives of Lee Jae Myung's comments on Japan. A lot of them are really quite strident. You know, he was very critical of his predecessor Yoon Suk-yeol's attempts to engage with Japan, and he has long been a proponent of this idea that cooperation with Japan ought to depend on new shows of remorse and things of that nature. But at least for the time being, he's taken a different tack. And while he was in Japan, him and Ishiba put out a joint statement at the end of or I'm not sure if statement is the right word, but a press release, kind of document. The first, I believe it was like the first written document that had come out of a Japan and Korea summit in something like 17 or 18 years. And it did not contain a lot of mentions of those types of issues, those types of thorny historical issues that have kind of plagued relations between the two sides for a very long time. And so I think that sort of, a lot of people in Japan took that as somewhat pleasantly surprising, and that created some optimism that the two sides would be able to work together on a level that most people in Japan probably didn't expect. And then seeing Lee then go on to Washington, I guess the question from the Japanese perspective was what this might mean for the prospects of trilateral cooperation between the three countries. Would Lee want to continue that? Would Lee see that as a kind of hindrance to executing his own foreign policy vision? And again, I think the general view in Japan, if you are someone who is in favor of this kind of trilateral cooperation, a mix of relief and pleasant surprise. I think Lee, in both of these kind of like major, his bilateral diplomatic debuts abroad, this two-country trip that he just embarked on, I think it's created some positive energy, but I still think that there's a lot of details yet to be worked out. I wouldn't, as Professor Park alluded, I might be a little bit more generous in my grading. I might say a B, but I would follow up with notes that there are, some things that need to be added, some things that need to be worked out, some more specific steps to be taken.
Right. So while you give the summit a V, I believe Professor Park gave it an incomplete evaluation. Stephen, while President Lee Jae Myung advanced his agendas in neighboring Japan and over in the U.S., he sent a special delegation to neighboring China. That being said, what has been the response from China with regard to the summit between the South Korean and U.S. leaders?
Well, I'm not aware of any kind of official response from China. I mean, I don't think that like Xi Jinping or the Chinese state media has said much that I'm aware of. I mean, that there's been coverage in foreign media kind of analyzing how China hangs over these other engagements. As China has just become such an important, strategically and economically such an important country, and smaller countries like South Korea are often described as kind of having to choose between loyalty to and engagement with the United States or with China, and being kind of caught in between them. China did come up in the engagement between Lee and Trump in a way that was kind of funny. I believe the idea of traveling to China, somebody mentioned that, and Trump kind of alluded, well, why don't we go there together? We'll ride in the same plane. We'll save greenhouse gases and do something good for the ozone. That's kind of encouraging in a way that they're able to speak about this openly in a kind of a non-ominous or not too serious way. But Lee's going to have to make some decisions which perhaps might come to the fore when the APEC summit is held here later this year. I believe that the South Korean side will be hoping that Xi Jinping does attend and that Trump does attend, and that every kind of influential and important world leader is here to give that event the gravitas that they want it to have, and have it be a real forum for important decisions to get made. But China is a tough book to read. I mean, people smarter than me spend their whole careers trying to parse exactly what's happening in the inner workings of that regime and what it all might mean for the rest of the world. So I'm sure China is watching quite closely what happens with Lee and how he engages with Japan and how he engages with Trump, and time will tell exactly how they will formulate their response to all of that.
Right. Professor Park, addressing an audience at a Washington think tank, President Lee Jae Myung also touched upon ties between Seoul and Beijing. What are your prospects, Professor, with regard to ties between South Korea and China under the Lee Jae Myung administration?
Okay, before I answer that question, if I have to give the grade right now, I will give a B+. It's not bad at all. Okay.
Oh, right.
So one of the things that surprised me most in the summit came on the August 25th during the President's keynote speech at the think tank in Washington. He openly declared that Korea would abandon the old formula, security with the United States, economy with China. In Korea, we said 한미경중. He said very clearly, we cannot take that position. We cannot act against the basic direction of the United States policy. And this is a very sharp break from what President Lee and Democratic Party used to say. In the past, Lee Jae Myung often stressed that it was the best to get along with both Washington and Beijing. People still remember his very famous saying, the so-called CSA remark, meaning Korea should avoid unnecessary entanglement of any conflict here in the Indo-Pacific. Before coming to Washington, he first went to Japan, as Steve mentioned, and met Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba. There he signaled a future-oriented approach rather than being trapped by the past. He even promised not to overturn 2015 Comfort Woman deal or the third-party compensation agreement on wartime labor, despite opposition from his own supporters. This attitude is very different from the closed nationalistic tone that once shaped the Democratic Party, captured by former President Roh Moo-hyun's slogan, so what if we are anti-American, so what if we are anti-Japanese? To me, this shows that the Lee Jae Myung administration government means by pragmatic diplomacy. It is about staying out of ideology or dogma and instead making very flexible choices based on the reality. And it could also help counter the mega camp's claim that Lee Jae Myung's government is somehow pro-China.
Right, I see. Stephen, despite the differences on perhaps tariffs and trade, the two leaders during their talks at the Oval Office on Monday appeared united with regard to easing tensions here on the Korean Peninsula by engaging North Korea. How is the foreign media framing these intentions?
I think some stories frame this as kind of like another area where Lee and Trump could have common ground in that they are both interested in the possibility of meeting with Kim Jong-un for very different reasons. We'll never really know what Trump's motivations were in trying to engage diplomatically with Kim Jong-un. We know that ultimately it didn't yield much. It all kind of ended with a sputter and with no lasting achievements. But I guess Trump just has bigger things going on in the U.S. and he's busy with a lot of other matters. So North Korea is not terribly high on his foreign policy priority list. But Lee comes at North Korea from a much different place. As I mentioned earlier, he's a longtime member of South Korea's Jinbo or left-leaning camp, for whom peaceful reunification of the peninsula is a long-standing goal. It's something that they believe in very strongly and that they have stuck to even as public opinion in South Korea has kind of strayed from that as a major priority. And I think just when Lee talks about wanting to engage diplomatically with North Korea, he's speaking kind of from his heart. He's speaking from a kind of a muscle memory of this is just something that has been a part of who he is politically and personally for a very long time. But all of that having been said, at the present moment, there's not much reason to believe that any of that really matters, just because Trump and Lee can say whatever they want about wanting to meet with Kim or wanting to hold any kind of encounter with North Korea. We have no reason to believe that North Korea is interested in that. They've said over and over again, North Korean state media in comments attributed to Kim Yo-jong have been really quite harsh and quite dismissive about Lee's overtures. And we have every reason to believe right now that North Korea is really much more focused on its relationship with China and with Russia, and is just kind of has turned its attention toward those countries and away from the pursuit of sanctions relief or the pursuit of cooperation with the South. They seem to have drawn the conclusion that there just isn't much to gain there. So, I was not rapt, or I was not really surprised or really taken in by these comments by Lee and Trump, because of course they would say that at this juncture. I mean, it makes sense for them to kind of leave that possibility open, but I think the chances of that leading to the kinds of engagements that we saw in 2019 or 2018 is very slim at the moment.
Right. And perhaps expanding on what Steven has just said, Professor Park, given today in a statement carried by its state-run media, North Korea dismissed President Lee Jae Myung's calls for denuclearization, calling them delusional. That being said, what are your suggestions, Professor Park, with regard to coaxing North Korea back to the dialogue table?
You're right. Just today, North Korea issued another statement and personally attacking President Lee Jae Myung by name. So I think right now it is very difficult, if not impossible, to imagine any kind of a North-South Korea's meaningful relations in the short term, at least. So we have to remember back in 2019 December at the 5th plenum of the 7th Party Central Committee, Pyongyang announced its so-called frontal breakthrough strategy. At that point, North Korea declared they would no longer seek any kind of a meaningful ties with the South. And in December 2023, at the 9th plenum of the 8th Central Committee, North Korea went even further. They adopted a new line, that is strategic direction, treating South Korea not as the same people, but as a hostile state and enemy. Unless this kind of a strategic direction and line changes, Pyongyang will simply refuse any real contact with Seoul. In fact, Kim Yo-jong has repeated this position 3 times in just the past month. So this is why close cooperation with the United States is now more important than ever for South Korea. North Korea, meanwhile, is being careful not to provoke President Trump while leaving the door open for dialogue. But they want arms control talks, not the denuclearization talks at all. If U.S.-North Korea dialogue does take place, Seoul will need to work hand in hand with Washington and try to use that opening to explore a breakthrough in inter-Korean relations. For now, neither Seoul nor Washington has released an official policy or a strategy toward Pyongyang yet. So I suggest that it is important to have both countries to come together and then coordinate and come up with a shared strategy with the same goals and the same methods.
All right, before seeking to engage North Korea again then. All right, Professor Park, as always, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you very much.
And Steven here in the studio, thank you very much for your time and thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. We return same time tomorrow, that is Thursday, with more panel discussion on the recent summit between Seoul and Washington.